It's really a big honor for me to have this exhibition here at the booth. I owe a lot to Seth and the staff here with bringing the show in and setting it up and really just making a wonderful presentation with this body of work. And the work actually started for me in about 1993 or 94. So in some ways this is kind of an older body of work. And really one of the first maybe serious groups of things that developed for me after graduate school. So it's really nice to kind of come back to some of this work in some ways, because some of my newer work is a little bit different, and I don't always look at this work. So a lot of it, I've pulled out and suddenly, I think, gained some new excitement over. But I'm going to start the lecture, or my little talk here, with an image of Bass Reeves, who was a really interesting character. He was actually a police officer or a lawman or a peace officer in the West in late 1800s. And I came across this image of him and the information about him in a book. And we actually feature some of the books in the exhibition. Because the books were so crucial for this body of work. There was a book called The Black West, written by a guy named William Katz. And he featured a number of really interesting personalities in this book, one of which was Bass Reeves. And encountering this bit of history was a real revelation for me. A lot of the book featured black cowboys, black Indians, and pioneers of one sort or another, and all of them having some kind of African or African American heritage. So it was just a really powerful connection suddenly, and a really interesting body of information that I felt like I could start to make paintings around. One of the biggest struggles of an artist is to find some good material. Some material that you feel passionately about and you think people might connect with. But this is one of the paintings that is about Bass Reeves and about his life to some degree. A lot of what happens in these paintings is that I get less interested in a kind of realistic portrait of an individual, and I look for a kind of symbolic or maybe a spiritual representation of these people. So in a lot of ways, the images, for me, function more about ideas and a kind of spiritual or emotional connection with the individual. One of the interesting things that started to happen with these paintings was a blending of my interest in the history and my interest in African art. So the kind of weird thing that happens with this image of Bass Reeves in the lower part of this painting is that he actually is imaged as they call these the Nkisis, these power figures that are made in parts of Africa that they're meant to repel evil. and they're meant as a kind of protection from, various uh, um, evil sources or evil forces. So there's a connection there that I think I'm trying to make with the painting and the sculpture, along with kind of embedding the painting with some more direct historical information, with a listing of maybe some of the cities or parts of the country that Bass Reeves might have operated in. But these Nkisi figures have had a really kind of powerful effect on me as a visual artist. There's so much kind of dramatic activity that happens in one of these sculptures with this, repetition of driving nails into the wood. The other, I think, very powerful personalities that come through in the history are some of the soldiers that operated throughout the West and throughout American history in general. And to hear some of the stories about some of the black soldiers, in particular here, the Buffalo Soldiers, I think for me, it really had a lot to do, or the impact on me was a kind of identification with these men in multiple ways. Interestingly enough, I never went to the military, but I spent 4 years in Army ROTC when I was in high school. I did 1 year in college, and thankfully bailed out after getting much more involved in the arts. But it's been interesting for me to kind of continue this engagement with the military, and I guess this idea of soldiering seems to come up for me with the activity with these paintings. But a lot of the soldiers for me are also imaged in this kind of spiritual, symbolic format. Again, I think I'm less interested in particular personalities and more interested in trying to deliver the idea of who they were and what they did, and a kind of emotional response to that. So the painting is kind of dirty. It does have scars and scratches, so to speak. And there is an effort to kind of capture the danger, the messiness of the business that these guys are involved in. I thought it was important to mention at least one of the big influences on my work. This is one of my instructors from Northwestern University, a guy named Ed Paskey, probably one of the most celebrated artists in Chicago. But you can see, in this image of his in the background, maybe some influence there with, these characters with, in this case, these large hats. Ed was a little more involved with magazine images and television images, and a kind of, dark, a kind of darkness, I think, runs through a lot of his work. But I've had to acknowledge some influence there with an interest in large heads, large portraits, and again, portraits that are more symbolic, more coded, you might say, than an actual representation. So here is an image attempting to kind of, make this connection between, the painting and the sculpture. And again, portraits that are more symbolic, more coded, you might say, than an actual representation. So here is an image attempting to kind of, make this connection between, the painting and the sculpture. And again, portraits that are more symbolic, more coded, you might say, than an actual representation. So here is an image African Americans or the black cowboy potentially, and Native American culture. And I think throughout a lot of the work you can see the African mask and African statuary that influences the drawing and the representation, with faces. This is another book that was very interesting. And the title, I think, tells you just about everything, but Katz really captures, I think, some of the physical relationships that happened throughout the West, throughout some of the early history of our country. And I think of this as a kind of, as he puts it, a hidden history. I think a lot of this material doesn't get talked about in history class. So he talks about some of the complexities of this kind of cultural mixing, cultural overlaps. This is a painting that, is again imaging the soldiers and, referencing, soldiers from different places, but all of them kind of caught in this place we call America, and serving in this, again, this kind of messy business of protection, securing the country. And I'm actually attempting to pair this painting with my painting. This older painting here was actually done in the early 1900s, I think. There's a piece that I saw recently in New York at the Guggenheim. There's a big exhibition of the Italian futurists. But the use of words here, words and figuration, and again a kind of mapping, reminded me of the way I've been putting together these American history paintings. And I think it's kind of interesting to think about the development of the frontier, the American frontier, as a kind of futurist movement, with all the contradictions and the kind of violence that I think the futurist painters were actually attempting to capture in their work. So there's a nice group of these smaller paintings, which I think are kind of operated in the same way. They're the history is kind of spinning throughout the paintings. So you have references to America, to Africa, to Europe, Mexico, and particular locations, particular events. This is probably the earliest painting in the group. I think it dates around 1994. One of the first paintings that I made that wanted to say something about black cowboys and the West. So in a strange way, the African mask, it dons a cowboy hat. It's this kind of weird pairing. And I think for me it was a kind of symbolic way to talk about the African in America. Here are a group of cowboys. I think these are actually cowboys who involved in rodeos or some kind of showmanship, so they're not doing actual cow work or cow herding uh, or particular cattle drive or something. These guys were roping steers and breaking horses. They were very much entertainers in a way. I think the guy on the end here is Bill Pickett, who was one of the most well-known of the black cowboys, or the black rodeo cowboys, the entertainer cowboys, you might say. But you really do kind of get a really nice kind of impact from the image like this. Again, a group of cowboys. And I'm not sure if these guys are actually involved in a real, again, a kind of actual herding situation or something. They seem to be pretty clean for cowboys. So I'm guessing that maybe this was another group of men involved in some kind of show or rodeo or something like that. Another image of Bill Pickett. And Bill Pickett was a really interesting character within the history. He was apparently an amazing rodeo figure. He would actually wrestle the steer to the ground. You know, that's one of the kind of classic rodeo activities. But one of the ways he would do it was to actually bite the steer on the lip. Is that right? The lower lip?
He invented steer wrestling.
Okay. But the biting of the steer on the lip would completely incapacitate the animal so that, you know, it would fall over immediately. And I have seen an image of this. There's an image of this out there somewhere. You know, and he's on the ground with the steer literally locked to his to his lips. It's quite a sight. So talk about grit. You know, a lot of grit there. Too much for me. So this is another image of this kind of spinning history and a kind of Western history with Native peoples represented and these kind of references maybe to ancestors with the masks and ancient hieroglyphs, Mexican hieroglyphs. And even some reference to Northwest Coast Indians with the black and white mask there. So things do kind of float around in this painting. Another really powerful image for me. I haven't read this book, but I was really taken with the image cover of this one. The scholarship around the black cowboys now seems to be really exploding. There's new books coming out regularly, it seems. This was a really interesting image for me. I think throughout the work, at a certain point, I really got pushed in some ways to make sure that I didn't just kind of get trapped with the kind of masculine imagery of the cowboy. So try to be a lot more conscious of the role of women and some kind of image of women within this body of work. But this was a a photograph of a woman who seemed to be, there didn't seem to be a whole lot of information about her. And I think it was in a book called Black Pioneers. But it was just a really powerful image of this woman. I call her a Western woman from the South, so kind of imposing a narrative on her. But the hat that she was wearing, the kind of determination in her face was, I don't know, felt like a good addition to the body of work. This is a woman named Diana Fletcher, who is also of dual heritage. She was part black and part Kiowa Indian. There seems to be a lot of unclarity about her history. They think that maybe she was a teacher at one of the early Hampton schools, or Hampton University, is it? But in this photo, she seems to really be carrying her heritage and her connections with both blackness and a kind of native culture very dramatically. This is Edmonia Lewis, who was actually an amazing sculptor. There's quite a bit of information about her, quite a bit of documentation of her work. She was a carver in marble. She did some amazing portraits. And again, a woman of dual heritage, apparently. She was, well, her mother was part Ojibwa Indian and part black, and her father was Haitian. This is a woman who is part of a group called the Yamasee, which I think is maybe connected to the Seminoles. But again, a very powerful presence. Some of the paintings in the exhibition, like this one, are painted on drop cloths. And, you know, they don't have a particular personality that is necessarily featured. But in my mind, we're much more about a kind of spiritual and a kind of emotional response and treatment of some of the complexity that I think I was responding to in the history. So some of the objects are, you know, less recognizable. This is another painting on a drop cloth. And we do have a particular reference here with Jim Beckworth, who was he was a trader and a trapper and kind of an adventurer out west. And apparently he spoke multiple native languages, so he was really interestingly connected to the West and to the complex kind of cultural machine, I think, that was at play, where, you know, making a living and survival seemed to be something that he did in some very dramatic ways. But I've kind of imagined here this conversation between him and this Indian. So, you know, there's this exchange of sorts. But it was a way to talk about language and relationships. And maybe I should say something about how crudely the thing is delivered. You know, it really is a kind of imagine interaction, and I think I was maybe trying to capture some of the grittiness of the frontier, living as a mountain man, and the kind of, kind of messiness it seemed to be around such business. I snapped this photo in the studio after kind of dragging this painting out of my storage. It's a painting that's actually never been shown. And as I've kind of pulled this exhibition together, I've realized how many of these paintings haven't been shown, and actually how big the group is. There's a nice handful of paintings that we decided wouldn't be in the exhibition. So it really is a big body of work, and maybe a body of work that I haven't always appreciated as much as I should. But I kind of wanted to have a moment with this painting. That's what this photo is about. You can see some of the Ed Paskey reference here with this kind of sinister eye. This is one of the Buffalo Soldiers. I call this piece Buffalo Coat. It was kind of pulled out of a blurry photograph that I'd come across in some of the research. But it had a nice mystery about it. The guy is really kind of lost in the coat. These guys are out in the weather often, and really kind of dealing with, I think, a good bit of adversity with what they were involved in. These are some other soldiers. This, I think, is from World War I. But I think it connected with the other work because of, I think, the strong presence of soldiers throughout this body of work. So I've been attracted to these images of black soldiers in particular. I think this history is important because it does, I think, it's important to make these connections with who we are as African Americans, and to know that we have been a part of the development of the country, spilling blood around the protection of the country, protection of its interests, for better or for worse. And certainly, the work that the Buffalo Soldiers were involved in with subjugating Native Americans on the frontier is, a really unfortunate situation, and I think a difficult part of that history. And I think soldiers in general, we can see that in the wars that we're involved in now, are placed in situations where they really don't perform very heroic acts. So it's not a pretty history, and I think part of what I've tried to do is to not necessarily celebrate